Okay, so today we are going to be discussing civilizational populism. This is the first of 2 days on the topic. Populism is a worldview, an ideology which sees society as being divided by two groups. One at the top being the corrupt elite, who take power away from the group at the bottom, that being the morally pure common people. Populists believe that society should aim to serve the common people and allow power to be held in their hands rather than in the hands of a corrupt elite. So this specifies a vertical opposition between a corrupt elite and a morally pure common people. However, there is also a horizontal opposition that intersects with this vertical opposition. The populist believes that there is a corrupt elite that are often in cooperation with outside groups and forces, and to the detriment of the common people. This collaboration between the corrupt elite and outsider groups and forces is meant to harm the common people further, so says the populist. There are different types of populists. There are left and right-wing populists. Left-wing populists, for example, have concerns about a corrupt elite cooperating with economic elites, such as the corporate world, to the detriment of morally pure common people. Whereas right-wing populists believe that the corrupt elite have more cultural concerns about the elite and how they are more willing to treat, let's say, immigrants, give them preferential treatment over native-born citizens. Before we proceed to the civilizational aspects of populism and how we will reach a conceptualization of civilizational populism as opposed to just the populism itself, I'm going to have a quick refresher as to what group threat theory is. Pictured here, if you forgot, is Herbert Blumer, the former NFL player turned Berkeley sociologist. Group threat theory contends that society consists of outgroups and in-groups. Outgroups are the subordinate group when they make an advancement of some kind, and that advancement could be economic, it could be social, it could be symbolic. When they make a type of advancement in society, progress, the in-group or the dominant group will feel threatened by this advancement. The out-group makes an advancement that challenges the in-group's dominant position. The in-group then feels threatened by the out-group, and through this threat, they eventually develop feelings of prejudice for the out-group. This dynamic of threat is the basic logic by which sociologists understand the formation of prejudice. Related to this point, I'm going to talk a little bit about crisis. Crisis has long been a cornerstone of populist theorizing. Populists depend upon a crisis, whether the crisis is actual or imagined, by developing fear through this crisis that is either happening or not. The populace is able to instill emotions among followers and mobilize them to feel attached to a populist party who is saying that they will stop the crisis. People in this fearful state of emotionality are more likely to reach for a sense of control in the form of populist parties. Populists convince their followers that they are the morally unique party that will overcome this crisis through an anti-establishment presentation, since populists tend to believe that it's the establishment that is the elites who are trying to create crises and impose threats upon the common people to harm them. The populist party presents themselves as being different from politics as usual by being anti-establishment and therefore committed to stopping the crisis and protecting the common people. It is worth noting that there could be many different types of crises as it relates to group threat theory. I will say that the size of the outgroup, the size of the subordinate group, is a factor that has been studied in the group threat literature, with some research suggesting, though not all, but some suggesting that the large numeric size of the outgroup intensifies the perceived threat or perceived crisis. So just for a couple of examples of how this plays out in society, I will turn to Sweden and Germany as two pretty illustrative cases of these dynamics. So, for example, there have been major spikes in migrant arrivals to Sweden in recent years. This time frame has coincided with a large surge in support for the Sweden Democrats, who are a populist party. So there's the large numeric size of the outgroup, that being immigrants from the Middle East mostly, has led to a state of fear and a belief that there is an oncoming crisis, and therefore there is a feeling that they need to reach for sources of control. And they find this in populist parties who are anti-establishment and who are committed to stopping crises such as mass immigration. Similarly, we have the same pattern in Germany. Sweden and Germany have both had very large increases in migrant arrivals. The outgroup has become larger in recent years. And as the outgroup becomes larger, we see more support for populist parties. In Germany, for example, as the migrant arrivals have increased into the country, support for the Alternative for Germany party has doubled between 2021 and 2025. It is worth noting that it tripled between 2013 and 2017. There is a book known as The Clash of Civilizations, a book that made a lot of noise when it came out. It is written by the now deceased Samuel P. Huntington. He was a Harvard political scientist who died in 2011. Huntington makes the case that social conflict will be characterized more so in civilizational terms in the future. He claims that the differences between civilizations are the product of centuries, and therefore they will not soon disappear. There's with this type of perception, there's the implication that cultural assimilation will be an impossibility, and that there will be with multiculturalism, there will be a rise in social conflicts on civilization in civilizational terms. These civilizational terms move us away from a sense of nation, though nationalist populism is certainly important, and toward a sort of religious-based classifications of civilization. So there's a sociologist known as Jose Casanova who provides a quote that illustrates this move away from nationalist to civilizational populism. Casanova writes, "Only a few decades ago, immigrants from Turkey and Germany were viewed as Turks and not as Muslims. Immigrants from Pakistan and the UK were viewed as Pakistani and not as Muslims. And immigrants from the Maghreb and France were viewed as Moroccans, Algerians, or Tunisians and not as Muslims. But today, throughout Europe, immigrants from Muslim countries are not only primarily classified as Muslims, but they have come to represent Islam with all the baggage." So there's this rise in a sort of civilizational identity, the us versus them narrative that is so pertinent to populism, where us is the common people and them tends to be either elites or the outside groups or forces that elites are either cooperating with or giving special treatment to. Us versus them is very common in populist rhetoric. It is increasingly taking on a civilizational form rather than a nationalist form. But nationalism, of course, is still important, and we still see it. It's not as if the sense of the nation is disappearing, but what is emerging alongside with it is a civilizational form of populism. To try to emphasize the divide between civilizational categories, religious classifications play a salient role. There is a sense that there is Christian civilization and Islamic civilization. And to the civilizational populist, civilizations cannot be compatible. Populist parties often use Christian language in conveying this sense of civilizational identity, even in cases when their voters are not religious. Even in very secular contexts, Christian language is being used. We see it in Germany, we see it in France, and we see it in the Netherlands. Diving into an example from Germany, Alternative for Germany, or AfD, leader Alice Weidel, pictured here, she says that she does not even believe in God. The voters of her party are more secular than of other party constituencies in Germany. It is one of the least religious constituencies in Germany. It should be noted that Germany has a multi-party system as opposed to the two-party system that we have here in the US. So the fact that it is the second least religious constituency shows the extent of its secularity. Research on the party shows that there is a negative relationship between AfD support and church attendance. But nevertheless, even though their party leader does not believe in a God, even though their voters do not attend church or believe in God as much as voters of other parties, they still very frequently use Christian language in their rhetoric, and they even state that they are, quote, the only Christian party left in Germany. So how does one make sense of this puzzle? Why is it that Christianity is being invoked so frequently among relatively secular people? So some of the literature suggests that Christianity is being used by populists in Europe as what they call a cultural identity marker. They are connecting with the cultural and civilizational aspects of Christianity rather than, say, a type of Christianity that is concerned with God's will or specific religious teachings or piousness. Some have even called it a secularized Christian identity. It is devoid of pious or faithful content. They claim that this secularized Christian identity helps brighten the us versus them divide that is so often invoked in populism. As Rogers Brubaker says, if they, quote unquote, are Muslim, then we, quote unquote, must be Christian. It helps Christian identity even if one does not pray, does not attend church, does not read the Bible, etc. The attachment to a Christian identity can help develop a sense of divide between Christian and Muslim civilization. It stresses an incompatibility between these two cultures. There is a common concept known in sociology of religion as believing without belonging, and this has been studied for some time. Essentially refers to people who are either spiritual but not religious, or who maybe believe in God but don't really attend church very much, don't belong to a religious community. With civilizational populism, we can, we could switch this and say that this is really a concept of belonging without believing. You have a sense of group identity and attachment to a Christian culturalized identity without necessarily believing in God or following certain religious teachings. It is a Christianity that is focused on culture and civilization, not of piousness or a reverence for God. Okay, so related to this conversation, I'm going to just briefly overview the concept known as ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is when one believes that their own culture, their sense of right and wrong, their norms, their values that they learned from their own culture is assumed to be correct and assumed to be in a dominant place on justifiable grounds. It is to assume that other cultures, other values that come from other cultures are inferior to one's own culture. I'm going to now, related to this concept, I will bring in Italian philosopher of the mid-20th century, Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci provides a demarcation between common sense and good sense. Common sense is not used here in the way that we use the term in everyday conversation. The way we use common sense in everyday conversation tends to be positive. We are referring to having an ability to understand that which is obviously true. Gramsci is not referring to it in the same way. Gramsci uses common sense to convey a negative quality of perception, namely that one who has common sense is rather passive and assumes that everything in society, its problems, its foibles, everything in society is simply a natural part of the way things are supposed to be. This produces a sense of intellectual laziness. It makes one not question social problems, not criticize or scrutinize them, but rather to passively accept them as a natural part of what human societies are supposed to be. Gramsci tells us that we should instead strive for good sense. Good sense is the critical outlook, to criticize these social problems, think of ways in which we can reach a fairer society, and to not assume that problems are simply a natural outcome. Now, in connection to Christian nationalism, which is this idea in which it is thought that Christianity, belonging to Christianity, is a central part of national or civilizational belonging, there's a sense of superiority that arises from the Christian nationalist attitude. When one assumes that Christianity is either superior to other religions or a central part of belonging, they look down at those who practice other religions because either they believe those people are worshiping false gods, or they consider them to be excluded from national belonging or civilizational belonging. So in connection to how this sort of naturalization connects to civilizational populism, it is worth noting that prejudice and threat are presented by civilizational populists as being natural and not to be questioned. It is a part of the common sense outlook. It is assumed that one feels prejudice for these outgroups on the basis of just how human beings naturally are, that we cannot possibly coexist with these groups of people. Civilizational populist parties and politicians use a set kind of folklore to try to present the fact that these feelings of prejudice you have should not be criticized through the use of good sense, but rather passively accepted through the more lethargic outlook of common sense. An example would be of trying to naturalize this perception of threat as being simply the quote unquote the way things are, would be the Freedom Party of Austria, who cites the historical event of the Turkish siege of 1683. And upon first glance, you might think, what does the Turkish siege of 1683 have anything to do with contemporary political situations? These parties reference these historical events, often from long ago, to try to emphasize the fact that these social conflicts we've had between civilizations have always been and therefore will always be present. This is a natural cultural conflict between these civilizations, is a natural part of their relationship. It has never changed in the past for centuries. Why would it change now? It is a way of trying to make it seem as if this cultural conflict is natural. This is what the civilizational populist politician tries to do. As the Freedom Party of Austria says, what did our forefathers fight against the Turks for? It wasn't so that we could let them all in. This way of historicizing threat can be found in many countries. Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary, Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, does something quite similar in this quote here, saying, "If you separate Western civilization from its Judeo-Christian heritage, the worst things in history happen. Let's be honest, the most evil things in modern history were carried out by people who hated Christianity. Don't be afraid to call your enemies by their name. They want to give up on Western values and create a new world, a post-Western world. Who is going to stop them if we don't? So there's a lot going on here. There is a sense that the Western civilization belongs to a Judeo-Christian heritage, so exhibiting a form of Christian nationalism and assuming so through common sense, saying that the worst things in history happen. So Judeo-Christian heritage is inextricable to Western civilization. And the worst things in history happen by those who hated Christianity. Don't be afraid to call your enemies by their name. So it's really creating a sense of crisis, creating a sense of threat, and on the basis of civilizational grounds. Who is going to stop them if we don't? Here presenting himself as sort of the populist savior in this political moment of crisis. Turning back to Germany, if you flip through the AfD manifesto, as I'm sure all of you have, you will find that they rely on relatively similar themes as well. In the manifesto, they write, "The AfD firmly opposes Islamic practice, which is directed against our liberal democratic constitutional order, our laws, and the Judeo-Christian and humanist foundations of our culture." So Judeo-Christian and humanism is seen as something that is inextricable to German culture or European culture, and that Islamic practice opposes the very foundation of what German society is. So it is not a matter of, perhaps that we could have cultural differences in coexistence, but rather that this difference is incompatible with the very foundation of German culture. In the same manifesto, the AfD write, "During the past few years, it has become evident that Muslim immigrants to Germany in particular only attain below average levels of education, training, and employment, as the birth rate is more than 1.8 children amongst immigrants, which is much higher than that of Germans. It will hasten the ethnic cultural changes in society." Okay, so again, a lot going here. So, I mean, first, of course, there's the description of Muslim immigrants having low levels of education and in employment, the implication being that they're not going to be able to contribute much to society. But then they discuss birth rates as well, saying that they have a much higher birth rate. This harkens back to a sort of Great Replacement conspiracy theory, where it is believed that globalist elites are helping non-white populations from other countries come into the society to take it over and have a sort of racial takeover. It also hinges upon the aspect of group threat that we discussed about the numeric size of the outgroup and how the numeric size of an outgroup is important in terms of the intensification of threat or crisis. As we see here, the AfD are concerned about the birth rates of the outgroup because it will overcome the dominant cultural position of the in-group. It will, quote, hasten the ethnic cultural changes in society. There are many different ways in which politicians can communicate a feeling of cultural conflict to their followers. Sometimes it's rhetoric, in writings through a manifesto, and also they can emotionally affect their followers with putting forward images that reflect their ideology. So here's a billboard from the AfD. They used the 1866 painting called "The Slave Market" in one of their political advertisements, which suggestively depicts several dark-skinned men with beards and turbans inspecting the teeth of a nude white woman. This translates here to "Europeans vote AfD so Europe doesn't become Eurabia." So in this form of nativism, we have not only this sort of historicizing of ethnic threat. I mean, it's obviously an old picture that the AfD is trying to refer to, showing that this sort of conflict has been happening for a long time. The civilizational tensions have been happening for a while, and therefore they will continue to occur in the present political moment. There's this notion also of immigrant men who are coming after Native women, so to speak, that is sort of emphasized here. This notion, it's also worth noting, has been connected to concerns of sort of racial purity. For example, if there's a concern that immigrants have a high birth rate, as we discussed in the previous slide, that they want to take Native women, then there is also a fear that the racial order of German society will cease to exist. Staying in Germany, there's this group known as Pegida, Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the Occident. Take a look at how they, just in the very name, Islamization, as if it is a process and an antagonizing process that Europeans must oppose, they must stand against. This sort of clash of civilization frame is emphasized here. And it invokes a sense of crisis because there is a sort of need to protect Western or Christian civilization. Pegida is a social movement that originated in Germany about 10 years ago and has spread to other European countries as well, though they've mostly had their success in Germany. They have held hundreds of rallies with tens of thousands of participants. Cultural conflicts, it should be known. I present all of these examples to you to show that group threat and civilizational populism, these are not simply philosophical or sociological concepts. They are such a central part of ongoing political developments and human perceptions and human behavior. Religion, it should be noted, can serve both as a source of social discrimination and of social compassion. So we discussed some of the ways in which religion is used to emphasize cultural divides. This is not meant to suggest that religion only produces a sense of cultural divides. There is a theory in the sociology of religion known as religious dominance theory, which contends that religious minorities are likely to exhibit empathy and tolerance for other religious minorities, whereas dominant religious groups are more likely to exhibit prejudice for religious minorities. This is not a universal law, of course. This will vary by context, but it has been found to be true in some cases. So religious minorities depend upon pluralism themselves. They depend upon pluralism, so they therefore exhibit pluralism for others who are not in a dominant position. They will exhibit empathy for other religious minorities because they can relate in terms of their position in society as being religious minorities themselves, whereas dominant religious groups may feel more entitled because their religious identity aligns with what is perceived as the national religious identity, and therefore they're less likely to be empathetic. This is not true in all cases. There are cases in which dominant religious groups are not hostile toward religious minorities. However, there are some findings, I should say, in sociology which suggest, which are at least partially conducive to this claim of religious dominance theory.